There is a prevailing method of thought that goes on that we assume that extroverts are the people who are able to lead with some degree of charisma, assertiveness, and that dominant presence was what was required for leadership, almost leadership by fear rather than leadership by merit. And there has been an assumption that we would see that somebody must be competent because they are loud, they're the loudest voice in the room, or they're most seen as the most senior person in the room, just simply by the fact that they are there. And neuroscience, up until now, hasn't really been able to add much to this until we start to see its neuroscience has emerged as a much more mature field that now validates that introversion is quite powerful and distinctively unique when it comes to leadership in a very different way than what an extroverted leadership may be. So the confusion may be that, well, if it's only extroverts who got to be leaders before, is that making them incompetent? This is not an introvert versus extrovert thing at all. There is room for both, and both are very, very much needed. What we are looking at is some of those assumptions that maybe said that introverts shouldn't be leaders, and turning those around and saying, actually, there's very powerful reasons why they should be leaders, and here's why they can be very powerful leaders indeed. There is a way that our brains are wired, and we've got the neuroscience to back this up, that there is a specific neurobiology of those who are introverted leaders, that they just literally think differently and in a very, very structural way, not just in a mindset way or a trained behavior way, but there is a way that the brain is wired differently. And this is where we see there's two very different brains. The extroverted brain is very much seeking a dopamine hit. It requires a lot of external stimulation, a lot of external validation as well from people, almost giving applause to the fact that they are leading and they're doing something. And it uses what is called the sympathetic nervous system. In other words, it requires outside stimulation, outside applause, outside validation in order to get its dopamine hit. Though the introvert brain works a lot differently. It relies on a much different set of neurochemicals that thrives in a lot more deep reflection using what is called the parasympathetic nervous system, where this particular set of chemicals will tend to take part in the higher frontal lobe and the blood flow in the frontal lobe. So that's the decision making logical part of the brain at the front tends to be much greater than what it is in the extrovert brain, which does tend to work more in the reactive environment rather than the planning and strategic. And with the frontal lobe being the seat of all the complex problem solving and long-term strategy thinking, that tends to be where we need to have a very strong sense of our leadership nous coming from. So two different brains, and one's not better than the other. In fact, they're both very, very useful in both ways. But we see that there's different purposes for those different structures as well. And when brought together in those rare individuals, not they're that rare, most individuals are able to use both very, very successfully, then you see why the power of one and the other isn't necessarily better than each other, but they certainly could help to provide a very different insight to problems in organizations or problems in companies or in social situations. However, the problem has been that traditionally we've seen loud leadership or loudership as the default, where extroverts are promoted very swiftly in companies, and they have a lot of very rapid speech, lots of charisma, lots of sociability that gets read as being capability. It's read as competence, the ability to be able to do things that others can't, which can be used to overpower people, play a power game. And because of that need for external validation in a lot of extroverts, you can see it being, I've seen it very, very recently in a university organization where a very charismatic leader was able to cover up a lot of incompetence simply by being fun to be around. And that has certainly been, a problem that's come up in the past many times, where the loudest people in the room tend to be the ones who draw the most attention and get promoted above and above other people. There is a cost, though. Forcing introverts to perform extrovertedly can lead to a lot of burnout and exhaustion and a lot of reduced performance simply just by mimicking those who are loud and those who are able to do more. They have found that they've had to be someone they're not, which is absolutely exhausting to people. The Wharton School of Research talks about the proactivity advantage, which is very much around those introverted managers when they're working with proactive teams as opposed to working with extroverted managers, that they have 14% higher weekly profits. And it's a very specific study, and it has all sorts of problems with it. It hasn't been fleshed out into many other studies yet, but it does seem to indicate that introverts don't view ambitious employees as a threat as much as what those more extroverted managers would. They seem to listen, process, and grant autonomy to those people to do better at those roles, creating what's called a virtuous circle of proactivity. So that whole idea of, rather than being threatened by those who are very, very good at what they do, who are below you, you actually encourage them to be better, because you're not trying to defend your own attention. You're actually very, very willing to share that attention amongst other people. Then we look at the strategic decision making of those extroverted and introverted people, and we look at people like, Warren Buffett, for instance. The Buffett archetype is that he does a lot of solo research. He very emotionally detached from the results of what he gets and from the investments he makes, and it makes massive, very, very real, well researched, very concentrated bets on particular investment strategies, but only after he's undergone massive research, strong analytics, and very strong vetting. The introverted decision maker tends to think less of what the group thinks, and they tend to resist a lot of that majority consensus that goes on, simply because an influencer has managed to tell them this is a great thing to do. They tend to look into lots of calculation of their own. They will not believe anything that anyone has to say until they've been able to validate it for themselves, which makes them very bold when they're going out to make those decisions. But that bold decision is made from a lot of logic and analysis and research behind it. So, in the global context, leadership does look different in different cultures, and we've got a very weird combination of East and West in Australia, not because of our exposure to Asia or our exposure to being a British colony in the first place, but simply because we have inherited both. So leadership in Tokyo tends to come from a more Eastern paradigm, where Japanese culture does actually really value the introverted traits as being something of an effective leader. The effective leader is not seen as somebody who is loud and boisterous and necessarily, very, very strongly charismatic. They look at more the idea of servant leadership, where, listening, consideration, foresight, making very considered decisions, and empathy for the people who work with them tend to be prized over that self-promotion idea. There are definitely outliers in this. It's not like the whole of Japanese economy is built on this, but this seems to be the paradigm that works best in Japanese culture. In their multinational mandate for this kind of thing, there's an idea that silence in meetings and emotional restraint are very strong competencies in things like Japanese culture. So rather than yelling over the top of, doing the Donald Trump, cutting people off, jumping in front and all that, doesn't make friends, and it doesn't help to build strong business alliances. What it does, it just tends to put people in a fear position, or tells them to just walk away. So silence in meetings is a very Japanese thing, where you just basically listen to what everyone has to say, and then you consider what your response will be before giving it, rather than just sort of shooting from the hip in that very American style of charismatic, highly individualistic and aggressive leadership. So some profiles of very quiet people who have been able to achieve greatly in their areas. Rosanna Penny, for instance, navigated the company called Hayward Healthcare through a bankruptcy, and was very calm, very analytic, and very, very empathetic when it came to the people who potentially could have been affected by that within Hayward Healthcare, and managed to get not just through that, but has thrived ever since. Ariana Huffington set up Huffington Post, no longer owns it now, but definitely set it up as an alternative news source, and overcame a lot of discouragement through people saying, hey, don't do this, don't this, you'll be an idiot, this is never going to work, by being very introverted about, not being a big loud person about, but actually being the background person, rather than having to always be the person who was up front, and took a lot of methodical approaches to taking risk that led to building a media empire, but was done very carefully. It was done very considered. It was done in a very highly researched, and taking small bets and building up to the big bet later. Even people who are considered these days to be a lot more charismatic, like Jack Dorsey, who founded Twitter, he stepped back from the spotlight and let sort of a lot of the other people at Twitter take the front end and do all the speaking and do all the presentation. I remember seeing a guy called Dom Segola, which is one of the founding team of Twitter back, gosh, it would have been 2008 or something like that, on the Gold Coast at a conference. And he was very, very well spoken, very well presented, could very easily talk in front of people. Whereas Jack tended to not do those events because he really wasn't the guy who wanted to do that and wasn't great at it, and still very much isn't. He was very much about empowering his very decentralized teams all over the planet with a lot of autonomy for what they did. Now, Twitter's very different now as X is under Elon Musk, which is very much top down. Let me dictate what you're going to do. But that wasn't the way it always was. Bill Gates, he was always about vigorous debate rather than ego, rather than him going, this is the way it must be. He'd be like, well, let us find the best way it should be, and helped to build Microsoft to over $600 billion in market value through a very deep focus on some fundamentals. Now, people who've come after Bill in that position as the CEO definitely have made some massive changes. You go through like very loud people like Steve Ballmer, who was all about being very, very present, buying into basketball teams and being very much the front man, to then Satya Nadella, who is a great front man, but runs Microsoft from a very considered, very almost accounting point of view, not as an engineer, but as someone who understands logistics, understands product development, and has a deep, deep value on making sure that people are united in their purpose rather than sitting in silos that won't work with each other, which was always a problem with Bill Gates. Kind of encouraging that kind of autonomy didn't really allow people to be able to connect very well with each other. So there was sort of an offset to that as well. So if you're in charge of a team or you're in charge of an organization, the HR sort of approach to things, you'd look at what works with helping to go beyond those usual psychometric tests, which tell us if someone's in a DISC or a DISC modeling or some sort of psychometric exam, which is going to peg them as a certain personality type, and sort of bringing this idea through the MSC EIT or Hogan assessments, which look at more than just the ability to be able to respond to certain situations in a very bold manner, but also look at the ability for someone to go into deep analytical skills or to have emotional intelligence or empathy, which in today's workplace is certainly just as valuable as those who know how to say the right thing at the right time in a very influential way. We can't live on influences alone. Influences are certainly important for getting people on board to do things, but like I'm going to use a Game of Thrones reference now. While Daenerys Targaryen was a great conqueror, she was definitely not a great ruler, and that showed in her downfall during that TV show. So you could actually see that some people who may be very good at conquering and bringing people on board may not be good operators, and you may need someone who is a little bit less extroverted and requiring of less validation to be able to then go and do those operationally specific things. Restorative niches is really good if you're running a business too, having some quiet zones for people to actually work quietly rather than. So the open office tends to be a great place for people who are so much more extroverted because they can be loud, be dominant, sort of exercise their control over people if that's what they seek to do, or get attention. Whereas when there's quiet zones for people to go through, that's where the introverts can sort of not be so overstimulated, not be so distracted, and return to their peak performance as analysts and people who are trying to explore concepts deeply. Also broadening communication to reduce the amount of live meetings that are required and instant responses on emails and chats, and having some channels where you don't have to respond first and the first response isn't somehow prioritized over everyone else's, where you allow time for people to consider their responses and then also prioritize written responses over calls. I'm certainly that person. I prioritize written responses over calls because they take time to produce and time to consider and time to answer correctly rather than just sort of throwing an idea straight at someone just from the hip. So that's something we try to not do so much of. We also don't want to institutionalize everything that's loud and ignore everything that's quiet. So the quiet revolution is like LinkedIn has put in place, which is the Quiet Ambassador program that trains employees on their neurobiology of personality, not just the loudness of things. So it rewards results, not just the amount of volume that they're putting out. And I've seen this certainly in the Sydney office at LinkedIn, where they've been able to get a lot more quality in what they're doing, and they're looking more at what the impact is over things rather than just simply what the amount of stuff they're pumping out. And companies that embed some kind of neurodiversity as well into culture, they seem to have unlocked a lot more leadership in areas of people that otherwise would be overlooked for leadership, including those who may be ADHD or could be on an autism spectrum of some description, are just as capable of leadership, but perhaps not in that immediately responsive and immediately can shoot from the hip and talk from a lectern kind of way. It's that more that quiet leadership that's more considered and definitely more methodical. It's a place for both. Absolutely, you need both. The world needs the Elon Musks, but it also needs the Jack Dorseys as well, and the Brene Browns as well. So introversion is not a deficit. It's certainly not a fault. It's not something which you go, well, this is something that you don't want to look for in people. It's a bit more divergent. Yes, it's not really what we normally think of as leadership in a world of influencers and Trumps and loud and rambunctious people, but it certainly is valuable. Now, at the same time, neither is extroversion a deficit. In fact, there's a great advantage in many situations that do require that person to be the front person. So co-leadership might be the model in your business that's required. The person who is the methodical person on the accounts, as well as the person who is out there talking to the customers and making them feel loved and wanted. So the key takeaways here is to sort of reframe that ideal that we only look at the extroverted people as being value and bringing value. Look at a bit of that neurobiology and the neuroscience, which actually shows that there is a very different way that both introverts and extroverts will present themselves in leadership situations and the way they'll make decisions. Build cultures that sort of look at both, that include the introvert and the extrovert, and deploying some sort of tools and ways of working with both kinds of people. Have the open office that allows the extroverts to shine, but also have those quiet spaces where the introverts and those who are neurodiverse may also be able to shine. And don't just reward the volume and those who yell loudest about how good they are. Reward the results, the outcomes, not just the box ticking that we tend to. If you'd like to learn a bit more about this, and it's only been a very short webinar today, you can learn more about it at that address you can see on the screen right now, or you can scan that QR code, get it on your mobile phone, and save that as a browser bookmark. This will go into a lot more detail than what I have, and certainly into the neurobiology and the neuroscience and the examples it's given as well. So please take a look at it, and also goes into a bit about why Australians got to sit in that kind of the east and the west as well. It's got a lot to do with maybe our convict background, but also some of the taking the best of East and of West and sort of combining it into some very, in some cases, very messed up ways of looking at leadership, but also some really cool ways of looking at leadership, where we tend to exist people that, we tend to examine opportunities and possibilities and people that we otherwise, if we follow down a particular path, wouldn't necessarily look at.